Why did the Soviet Union collapse? When reform became the point of no return. In 1991, the hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin. A superpower that had once rivaled the United States, defeated fascism, and sent the first human into space officially ceased to exist. The question is not only, why did the Soviet Union collapse, but also, how could a system that lasted more than 70 years unravel within just a few years of reform? Many argue that it was the inevitable result of a stagnant economic model. But if we look more closely, before 1985 the Soviet Union was not a country on the verge of death. Yes, there were difficulties, bureaucracy, inefficiency, and economic slowdown, but the state apparatus still functioned. The military remained powerful, and society was largely under control. So what transformed stagnation into collapse? Reform. When the attempt to save the system began to break it apart. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he appeared as the symbol of a younger and more dynamic generation of leadership. He promised change and launched Perestroika, a program of restructuring. In theory, the reform aimed to make the Soviet economy more efficient and modern. A major focus was the modernization of the machine-building sector, with the ambition of upgrading the entire industrial base. But an economy is not a machine that can be disassembled and rebuilt piece by piece without affecting the whole system. As resources were heavily concentrated in certain industries, other sectors began to suffer shortages. Consumer goods became scarce. Supply and demand fell out of balance. Hidden inflation increased. Ordinary citizens found themselves standing in longer and longer lines just to buy everyday necessities. The most dangerous problem was timing. Economic reforms had not yet produced results when political reforms began to expand. Through glasnost, the government allowed greater openness in media and public discourse. Journalists could criticize officials. Historical narratives could be re-examined. Past mistakes could be openly discussed. From a moral standpoint, this was a major step forward. But from the perspective of system stability, it was like removing the pillars supporting a building before new columns had been built to replace them. Public trust in the Communist Party began to decline. Confidence in the ideological model weakened. Once the legitimacy of the system was openly questioned, the entire structure of authority started to lose cohesion. Reform was intended to save the system. Instead, it unintentionally accelerated the erosion of its foundations. The national question. When the center hesitated and the periphery drifted away. The Soviet Union was not a single nation-state. It was a multi-ethnic federation composed of numerous republics, each with its own history, culture, and aspirations. As reforms opened up political space, independence movements in regions such as the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Georgia grew louder and more organized. These tensions were not new, they had existed for decades, but for the first time they could surface openly. The real problem was not simply the rise of separatist movements. It was the uncertain response from the central government. In some places, authorities were instructed not to use force. In others, local leaders received no clear guidance from Moscow. At times the central government acted firmly, at other moments it made concessions. This inconsistency created confusion throughout the system. A federal state survives through two key elements: consensus and control. When consensus weakens and control becomes uncertain, disintegration becomes only a matter of time. Foreign policy and the new political thinking, détente with a cost. In foreign policy, Gorbachev pursued what he called new political thinking. He reduced tensions with Western countries, signed arms reduction agreements, and withdrew Soviet forces from several strategic regions. The world breathed a sigh of relief. The threat of nuclear war decreased. In the West, Gorbachev was widely praised as a courageous reformer. But inside the Soviet Union, the view was more complicated. When a superpower retreats from key geopolitical positions while its internal stability is already fragile, the change is not merely a policy adjustment, it signals a shift in global standing. Soviet influence over its allied states declined. The balance of power began to move. At the same time, several controversial details fueled suspicion within Soviet political circles: private meetings with Western leaders, discussions without formal transcripts, and expectations from Western governments even before Gorbachev became General Secretary. These details can be interpreted in many different ways. Yet together they contributed to a growing belief among some observers that reform was not merely a domestic adjustment. It represented a deeper strategic transformation of the Soviet system itself. When peaceful evolution became an invisible battlefield. In the previous part, we talked about internal mistakes during the reform process. In this section, I want to look at another direction with you, the external environment. There is a viewpoint that the Soviet Union did not collapse solely because of internal crises, but also because of a long-term, organized and carefully calculated strategy from the West, especially the United States. From this perspective, the East-West confrontation during the Cold War was not fought only with tanks, missiles, or nuclear submarines. It also unfolded through quieter and more subtle methods: ideology, economic pressure, institutional influence, and even individuals within the system. Peaceful evolution, changing the system from within. After decades of military rivalry, many Western analysts themselves acknowledged that a direct military confrontation with the Soviet Union would be extremely costly and dangerous. A full-scale war could destroy both sides. So if the system could not be defeated from the outside, the alternative would be to weaken it from within. According to this interpretation, the strategic focus was the central political structure of the Soviet state, especially the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In a highly centralized political system, if the core of power weakens, the entire structure may lose its support. New battlefields emerged. The battle for information and media. The battle for organizational influence and personnel. The battle in finance and economic pressure. And especially psychological warfare. Ideas such as freedom and democracy spread more strongly during the reform era. Western foundations, research institutes, and academic centers expanded their activities in the Soviet Union. Conferences, academic exchanges, and expert dialogues became far more frequent than before 1985. From one perspective, this looked like international integration. But from a national security perspective, some interpreted it as a systematic penetration of ideological and intellectual influence. According to the viewpoint reflected in many post-Soviet analyses, the most dangerous dynamic was the interaction between external pressure and internal opportunism, when outside forces and internal divisions reinforce each other. Psychological and organizational warfare. When trust begins to erode. Western researchers did not study the Soviet Union only at the national level. They also analyzed the personalities, ambitions, and psychological traits of individual Soviet leaders. An entire field sometimes referred to as Kremlinology emerged to interpret the internal politics of the Kremlin. Psychological influence was directed toward two main groups. The leadership, to encourage hesitation, compromise, or strategic miscalculation. The broader population, to create doubt about the political system they once trusted. When media openness expanded under glasnost, many historical mistakes of the Soviet system were revealed publicly. From a transparency standpoint, this was a significant step forward. However, it also produced a shock to public confidence. A society can sometimes endure economic hardship or shortages. But when belief in the legitimacy of the political system begins to collapse, the political foundation itself starts to crack. At the same time, there were claims about what some analysts described as organizational warfare. These included allegations that rumors, political scandals, and internal conflicts were amplified in order to weaken certain political figures while enabling others to rise. For example, discussions often mention figures like Grigory Romanov, who was reportedly pushed out of the leadership race, and suspicions surrounding the political rise of Mikhail Gorbachev. Historians continue to debate many of these claims, but in this interpretation, they are seen as part of a complex political struggle happening behind the scenes. Economic and financial pressure. When oil and gold become strategic weapons. One critical vulnerability of the Soviet economy was its reliance on oil exports to earn foreign currency. When global oil prices fell sharply in the early 1980s, partly due to increased production from Saudi Arabia, the Soviet Union's revenue was severely affected. Some analysts argue that the United States encouraged policies that influenced global oil markets in order to place economic pressure on the Soviet budget. Even a small decline in oil prices could cost the Soviet treasury billions of dollars in lost revenue. At the same time, the Soviet Union reportedly had to sell large amounts of its gold reserves. If gold is considered the final financial cushion of a national economy, then large-scale gold sales suggest significant fiscal strain. Meanwhile, the United States implemented a series of national security directives designed to restrict the Soviet Union's access to advanced Western technologies. For an economy already struggling with stagnation, being cut off from technological upgrades created even greater difficulties. From this perspective, the strategy resembled controlled pressure, exhausting a rival economically and technologically without firing a single shot. Intelligence networks and agents of influence. One particularly sensitive issue discussed in some materials concerns the concept of agents of influence. According to documents discussed in Supreme Soviet debates in 1991, the Central Intelligence Agency was accused of attempting to recruit individuals within the Soviet system who had strong potential for future advancement. The idea behind an agent of influence is not simply someone who passes information. Rather, it refers to a person capable of shaping decisions and policies from within the system itself. If such influence networks existed on a large scale, it would represent not merely traditional espionage but a deeper form of strategic infiltration into political structures. However, from an academic standpoint, it must be said clearly that many of these accusations remain controversial. International historians have not reached a consensus, and definitive evidence remains debated. Nevertheless, within post-Soviet political discourse, this argument remains powerful. The Soviet Union did not collapse only because of internal weaknesses, but also because external forces exploited and deepened those weaknesses. August 1991, the final blow. The events of 1991 Soviet coup attempt became the final turning point. In this interpretation, the coup attempt by the State Committee on the State of Emergency was not simply a conservative rebellion against reform, but part of a far more complex political struggle. When the coup failed, real political power quickly shifted to Boris Yeltsin. The Communist Party was suspended, and the old political center lost its authority. Just 4 months later, the dissolution of the Soviet Union officially ended the existence of the Soviet state. Some people believe this was the inevitable result of misguided reforms. Others argue it was a precisely timed strike delivered when the system had already reached its weakest moment. The lesson: a nation's strength is not only military. Regardless of which explanation you find more convincing, one thing is clear. A political system can be weakened not only by military conflict, but also by ideological pressure, economic warfare, organizational disruption, and the erosion of public trust. The Soviet Union possessed thousands of nuclear warheads. Yet the force that ultimately brought it down was not bombs or missiles, but the simultaneous weakening of its economy, its political legitimacy, its institutions, and its capacity for control. And perhaps the most important question this history leaves behind is this: when a nation faces external pressure, what matters more, resisting outside enemies, or strengthening its internal resilience so that no one can exploit its weaknesses? Because when internal strength is solid, external pressure remains just pressure. But when internal cracks already exist, sometimes a small push is enough to change the course of history.